October 15, 1944. The transport truck rumbled through the pine forests of central Louisiana, carrying 43 German women toward an uncertain fate. They had been captured 3 weeks earlier in France as Allied forces swept through the collapsing German defensive lines. Now, after a harrowing journey across the Atlantic in the cramped hold of a military transport ship, they were about to become America's most unusual prisoners of war. Among them sat 22-year-old Marguerite Fischer, her gray Wehrmacht auxiliary uniform hanging loose on a frame that had lost 15 pounds during the voyage. She pressed her hand against her empty stomach, trying to ignore the gnawing hunger that had become her constant companion. Through the gaps in the truck's canvas covering, she caught glimpses of a landscape so alien it might have been another planet. Towering pine trees stretched endlessly in every direction, their trunks draped with strange gray moss that hung like the beards of old men. The air was thick and humid, nothing like the crisp autumn weather of her native Munich. Beside her, 19-year-old Elsa Braun clutched a small photograph of her family, her blue eyes red from crying. Across from them, 31-year-old Hilde Schneider sat with military stiffness, her jaw clenched in defiance despite the fear flickering behind her eyes. These women had served as communications officers, clerks, and nurses for the Wehrmacht, believing they were defending their homeland from barbaric enemies. Now they were the prisoners, and terror whispered through their ranks about what awaited them. The propaganda they had been fed painted Americans as cruel and savage, particularly the black soldiers they might encounter. Marguerite expected beatings, starvation, perhaps worse. What she did not expect was the smell that hit her as the truck finally rumbled through the gates of Camp Claiborne. Someone was cooking. The scent drifted through the humid Louisiana air, rich and savory, carrying notes of frying oil and spices Marguerite couldn't identify. Her stomach clenched painfully, and she heard several other women gasp softly at the unexpected aroma. The truck jerked to a halt, and rough hands pulled back the canvas covering. Marguerite squinted against the sudden brightness, her eyes adjusting to reveal a scene that contradicted everything she had been taught. The camp stretched before them, organized and clean, with neat rows of wooden barracks, surrounded by wire fencing. American soldiers stood at attention, but there was no cruelty in their faces, only weary professionalism mixed with curiosity. A tall officer with graying temples stepped forward. Captain William Green surveyed the women with an expression Margaret couldn't quite read. Not hatred, not contempt, but something closer to sympathy. Through a translator, he spoke words that seemed impossible. "You are prisoners of war under the protection of the Geneva Convention. You will be treated with dignity and respect. You will be housed, clothed, and fed. No one here will harm you." Then the kitchen door opened, and an elderly black man emerged carrying a large covered pot. Samuel Washington moved with quiet dignity as he set the pot on a long wooden table. Other staff followed with plates and dishes. The smell intensified. Captain Green spoke again. "You've had a long journey. You must be hungry. We'll process your paperwork after you've had a chance to eat." The German women stood in an uncertain cluster as American soldiers guided them toward the long wooden tables. Marguerite's legs trembled from exhaustion and hunger, but she forced herself to maintain some dignity as she took her place on the rough bench. Around her, the other prisoners sat with the same rigid posture, their eyes darting between the covered dishes and the Americans who surrounded them. This had to be a trick. Some cruel psychological game before the real punishment began. Yet the smells emanating from those pots told a different story, one that made Marguerite's empty stomach twist with painful longing. Samuel Washington moved among the tables with practiced ease, his dark hands lifting lids from steaming dishes. The first was filled with golden fried chicken, glistening with oil and spices. The second held fluffy white rice. The third contained something green that Marguerite had never seen before, cut into small rounds and fried to a crispy perfection. The fourth dish held cornbread, its yellow surface dotted with butter that melted into tiny rivers. There were collard greens, black-eyed peas, sweet potatoes candied with brown sugar. It was a feast that would have been impressive even in peacetime Germany, let alone in a prison camp during war. Private Mueller, the young translator, stood nearby and began explaining each dish as Samuel served it. But the women barely heard him. They were transfixed by the portions being placed on their plates. Not thin gruel. Not meager rations. These were full plates, heaping with food, more than Marguerite had seen in a single meal in over a year. Elsa began crying again, staring at her plate as if it might vanish if she blinked. Hilda's military composure finally cracked completely, her hands shaking as she reached for her fork. Samuel paused beside Marguerite's place, using tongs to add several pieces of the mysterious fried rounds to her already full plate. She looked up at him. This black man her propaganda had taught her to fear, and saw only kindness in his weathered face. "That's fried okra," he said in English, his voice soft and warm. Private Mueller quickly translated, though the words meant nothing to her. Okra. She had never heard of such a vegetable. It looked almost like small green fingers, breaded and fried until golden brown. Captain Green stood at the head of the tables and spoke through the translator. "Please eat. There is plenty more if you want seconds." For a long moment, none of the women moved. They simply stared at their plates, overwhelmed by abundance they no longer knew how to process. Then Marguerite picked up her fork with trembling fingers. She had been raised with proper German table manners, taught to eat with dignity and restraint. But hunger overrode years of conditioning. She speared one of the fried okra pieces and brought it to her lips. The first bite exploded with flavor. The breading was crispy and seasoned, giving way to a tender interior unlike anything she had ever tasted. Slightly sweet, with a texture both soft and substantial. She closed her eyes, and for a moment, the war disappeared. There was only this taste, this moment of pure pleasure after months of deprivation. Around her, other women were having similar revelations. The sound of crying mixed with the clink of forks as 43 enemy prisoners experienced something unexpected: satisfaction. Marguerite ate with a desperation that embarrassed her, but she couldn't stop. Each bite of fried okra seemed to communicate something beyond mere sustenance. This was food prepared with care, seasoned with attention, served with an intention she couldn't quite name. Around her, the other women were experiencing their own private revelations. Elsa had moved on to the cornbread, tears streaming down her face as she tasted the buttery sweetness. Hilda ate methodically, but Marguerite noticed her hands had stopped shaking, replaced by something that looked almost like wonder. Samuel Washington moved among the tables, refilling plates without being asked, offering seconds before anyone had the courage to request them. He spoke little, but his presence carried a weight of compassion that transcended language barriers. When he noticed Marguerite staring at the empty spot on her plate where the fried okra had been, he smiled gently and added 3 more pieces without a word. She looked up at him. This man she had been taught represented everything barbaric about America, and felt something crack open inside her chest. How could cruelty coexist with such kindness? How could the enemy feed prisoners like honored guests? The questions began in whispers. German words passed between women who couldn't reconcile what they were experiencing with what they had been told. "Why are they doing this?" Elsa asked, her voice barely audible. "Is it poison?" another woman suggested, though even she sounded doubtful. Hilda, ever the pragmatist, shook her head. "If they wanted us dead, they wouldn't waste this much food. This is something else." But what that something else might be, none of them could say. They had been trained to understand war in terms of strength and weakness, victory and defeat, friend and enemy. There was no training for this, no protocol for processing generosity from those you had been taught to hate. Marguerite picked up another piece of fried okra, examining it closely before taking a bite. The vegetable had become symbolic of her confusion. It was foreign, unknown, from a culture she had been raised to despise. Yet it was delicious, nourishing, given freely. She thought about the meals she had eaten in Germany before the war. The rigid formality of her family's dining table, the constant emphasis on propriety and restraint. There had been order there, structure, rules that everyone understood. But had there been this? This simple act of feeding someone without asking for anything in return? As the meal continued, the tension in the compound began to shift. Not disappearing entirely, but softening around the edges. Full stomachs have a way of making fear less sharp, suspicion less immediate. Several women actually smiled, hesitant and uncertain, but real. Captain Green watched from a distance, his expression thoughtful. Samuel returned to the kitchen, already planning tomorrow's menu. And Marguerite sat with an empty plate and a full stomach, staring at the last crumbs of cornbread and wondering if everything she had believed about the world had just been proven wrong by a single meal. The fried okra sat heavy in her stomach, but heavier still was the weight of a question she couldn't answer. If the Americans could be this kind, what did that make her? 3 weeks passed in a strange rhythm of confusion and routine. The German women were assigned to barracks, given clean uniforms, and put to work on basic camp maintenance. But the meals continued to be abundant, varied, and inexplicably generous. Marguerite found herself looking forward to dinner not just for the food, but for the brief moments when Samuel would emerge from the kitchen, his presence somehow making the barbed wire and guard towers feel less oppressive. She had begun to recognize the different dishes he prepared. Gumbo thick with okra and shrimp. Red beans and rice seasoned with spices that made her tongue tingle. Biscuits so light they seemed to float on the plate. And always, several times a week, fried okra that had become her favorite. The other prisoners had noticed her fascination. "You and that strange vegetable," Elsa teased one evening. "I think you dream about it." Marguerite couldn't deny it. There was something about the fried okra that represented everything she was trying to understand about this place. It was humble, simple, but prepared with a care that elevated it into something more. On the 23rd day of their captivity, Captain Green made an announcement that would change everything. Through Private Mueller, he explained that the camp needed additional kitchen help. German prisoners who volunteered would work alongside American staff, learning to prepare meals for the entire compound. The work would be voluntary, and those who participated would receive small privileges like additional writing paper and access to the camp library. Marguerite's hands shot up before she fully processed what she was doing. Around her, 5 other women raised their hands as well, but she barely noticed them. All she could think about was the opportunity to understand, to learn the secrets behind those meals that had been slowly dismantling her certainty about who was good and who was evil in this war. The next morning, she reported to the kitchen before dawn. Samuel was already there, stirring a massive pot of grits, his movements efficient and practiced. He looked up when she entered, and something that might have been approval flickered across his weathered face. Through gestures and Private Mueller's occasional translations, Samuel began teaching her the fundamentals of Southern cooking. He showed her how to properly season a cast-iron skillet, how to judge when oil was hot enough for frying, how to prepare a roux that would form the foundation of a proper gumbo. But more than techniques, he taught her about intention. "Cooking ain't just about filling bellies," he said, while Marguerite carefully breaded okra pieces, Mueller translating each word. "It's about showing folks they matter, that somebody cares enough to do it right." Marguerite's hand stilled over the breading bowl. In all her training with the Wehrmacht, in all her education in Munich, no one had ever suggested that the act of feeding someone could be an expression of their fundamental worth as a human being. She looked down at the okra pieces, waiting to be fried, seeing them differently now. Not just food, but communication. Not just sustenance, but dignity made edible. Samuel handed her the tongs and gestured toward the hot oil. "Go on," he said. "Time you learned to make it yourself." The kitchen became Marguerite's education in everything she hadn't known she needed to learn. Samuel worked with patient precision, demonstrating techniques that had been passed down through generations. He showed her how to cut okra into perfect rounds, not too thick or they wouldn't cook through, not too thin or they would burn. How to season the cornmeal breading with just enough salt and pepper to enhance without overwhelming. How to maintain the oil at exactly the right temperature so the coating would crisp without becoming greasy. But the real lessons went deeper than cooking. One morning, while Marguerite carefully lowered breaded okra into hot oil, Samuel began talking about his childhood in Mississippi. Private Mueller translated haltingly, struggling to capture the nuances of Samuel's soft drawl. He spoke about picking cotton in fields that stretched to the horizon, about Jim Crow laws that made him use separate water fountains, about a son who had been killed by white men for looking at someone the wrong way. Marguerite's hands froze over the skillet. She looked at this man who had shown her nothing but kindness, and realized he had more reason to hate than she did. He had lived under oppression in the very country that now lectured Germany about freedom and democracy. "Why do you treat us so well?" she asked through Mueller, her voice breaking slightly. "After everything, after what your own country has done to you, why show kindness to enemy prisoners?" Samuel was quiet for a long moment, watching the okra turn golden in the bubbling oil. Then he spoke words that Mueller translated carefully. "Because somebody has to choose different. Hate just makes more hate. But kindness, real kindness, that can break the cycle. Maybe not all at once, but piece by piece, person by person." He used the slotted spoon to remove the perfectly fried okra, letting excess oil drain before placing them on the serving platter. "Besides," he added with a slight smile, "you can't hate somebody once you've cooked for them. Feeding folks, really feeding them right, it makes you see their humanity whether you want to or not." Marguerite thought about the meals she had prepared back in Germany. The rigid dinner parties where presentation mattered more than nourishment, where food was a display of status rather than an act of care. She thought about the propaganda posters that reduced entire peoples to caricatures, making it easier to hate them without ever seeing their faces. And she thought about how a simple vegetable, breaded and fried, had become the key that unlocked her understanding of what hospitality actually meant. Over the following weeks, Samuel taught her to make gumbo, jambalaya, and red beans and rice. He showed her how to prepare collard greens with ham hocks, how to bake cornbread that was crispy on the outside and tender within, how to candy sweet potatoes until they glistened like amber. But more importantly, he taught her that abundance wasn't about having more than you needed. It was about having enough to share, and choosing to share it with those who had no right to expect your generosity. That, Samuel said while Marguerite stirred a pot of file gumbo, was what separated civilization from barbarism. Not military might or industrial capacity, but the simple choice to feed your enemy as if they were your guest. April 19, 1945. The news arrived in the camp library through American newspapers that Captain Green had started making available to the prisoners. Marguerite was reviewing her English lessons when she saw the photographs. Grainy black and white images of skeletal figures behind barbed wire, bodies stacked like cordwood, ovens. The headline read, "Buchenwald Death Camp Liberated by American Forces." Her hands began to shake as she read the accompanying article, Mueller helping her translate the more difficult passages. Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Auschwitz. Names of places she had never heard, but which apparently existed in the same Germany she had proudly served. The newspaper described systematic murder on a scale her mind couldn't process. Millions dead, women, children, entire families erased from existence with industrial efficiency. Gas chambers disguised as showers, medical experiments, forced labor until death, and all of it happening in camps scattered across the Reich, while she had been operating radios and attending dances for Wehrmacht officers. Elsa found her there an hour later, still staring at the photographs. "Marguerite," she whispered in German, "have you seen?" Her voice was hollow, scraped raw by the same horror that was freezing Marguerite's blood. "They're saying we, our country, it can't be real. It can't be." But more newspapers arrived each day, each one carrying fresh revelations. Testimonies from survivors. Accounts from American and British soldiers who had liberated the camps. photographs that became more horrifying with each publication. The German women gathered around these papers like mourners around a grave, watching their national identity die in grainy newsprint. That evening, Marguerite was scheduled to help prepare dinner. She moved through the kitchen like a ghost, her hands performing familiar tasks while her mind struggled with incomprehensible truths. Samuel watched her with concern as she breaded okra with mechanical precision, her eyes distant and red from crying. She was supposed to monitor the frying temperature, but her attention wandered. The oil grew too hot. Smoke began to rise from the skillet. The first batch of okra turned black, then began to burn in earnest. Samuel quickly moved the skillet off the heat, but Marguerite didn't even notice. She was staring at her hands, the same hands that had operated communications equipment for the Wehrmacht, and seeing them covered in blood she hadn't known was being spilled. "I didn't know," she whispered in German, then again in broken English. "I didn't know. I didn't know. I didn't know." The words became a mantra, a desperate prayer for absolution that she knew she didn't deserve. Samuel guided her away from the stove, into the small pantry where sacks of flour and rice were stored. Private Mueller followed, ready to translate, but Samuel waved him away. Some moments transcended language. He didn't offer empty comfort or false reassurances. He simply stood there while Marguerite wept, her shoulders shaking with the weight of complicity she couldn't escape. "What do I do now?" she finally asked in halting English, looking up at this man who had somehow become her moral compass. "How do I live knowing this?" Samuel's expression was grave, but not unkind. "Same way anybody does after they learn a terrible truth," he said slowly, waiting for her to understand each word. "You decide what kind of person you're going to be going forward. Can't change the past, but the future, that's still unwritten." May 7, 1945. Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. In Camp Claiborne, the news arrived with a mixture of relief and dread among the German prisoners. They were no longer soldiers serving an active military force. They were simply defeated enemies waiting to discover their fate. Captain Green announced that repatriation procedures would begin within weeks. The women would be processed and returned to whatever remained of their homeland. The announcement should have brought joy, or at least resolution. Instead, it brought a creeping anxiety that manifested in unexpected ways. Dinner that evening was one of Samuel's specialties. Fried chicken, collard greens, cornbread, and fried okra. But food supplies had been affected by transport disruptions, and portions were smaller than usual. Not starvation rations by any means, but noticeably less abundant than what the women had grown accustomed to over the past months. Samuel had prepared enough okra for each woman to receive 3 pieces instead of the usual 5 or 6. It shouldn't have mattered. They were still being fed better than most people in Europe. But something had shifted in the prisoners since the surrender announcement. The security they had found in the camp's routines now felt temporary, fragile, about to be snatched away. Marguerite watched from her position, helping serve as tensions began to rise at one of the tables. Hilda had reached for the serving platter of fried okra at the same moment as another woman, a former nurse named Greta Hoffman. For a moment, both women held the platter between them. "I haven't had any yet," Hilda said in German, her voice tight. "Neither have I," Greta replied, not letting go. "And I was here first." The women around them stopped eating, sensing the sudden shift in atmosphere. Marguerite moved toward the table, intending to mediate, but before she could intervene, Hilda jerked the platter toward herself. Several pieces of okra slid off onto the table. Greta lunged forward to save them, and suddenly both women were on their feet, voices rising in rapid German. "You always take more than your share," Greta shouted. "I've watched you, always grabbing extra. That's a lie." Hilda's face flushed red. "You're just angry because you know we're going back to nothing. Taking it out on me won't change that." Other women joined in, some defending Hilda, others siding with Greta. Within seconds, the entire dining hall erupted in argument. Women who had stood together in service to the Reich, who had endured capture and imprisonment as comrades, were now shouting at each other over fried okra. The absurdity of it hung in the air like smoke. Marguerite stood frozen, watching women fight over the last pieces of a vegetable none of them had known existed 7 months ago. American guards moved in to restore order, but they looked more bewildered than angry. Samuel emerged from the kitchen carrying another platter of fried okra, freshly cooked and still steaming. He set it down on the table with a heavy thud that cut through the shouting. The sudden silence was deafening. 43 women stared at the golden pieces, then at each other, then at their own hands, still reaching, still grasping. The shame was immediate and overwhelming. They had become everything they feared. Not prisoners fighting for survival, but people who had found something precious and couldn't bear the thought of losing it. Morning of May 15th arrived with heavy clouds hanging low over the Louisiana pines. Captain Green had called a formal assembly for all German prisoners to announce the official repatriation procedures. The 43 women gathered in the main hall, their faces reflecting months of internal struggle about what returning to Germany would actually mean. Marguerite sat in the front row, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Beside her, Elsa twisted a handkerchief between nervous fingers. Hilda sat with rigid military bearing, but Marguerite could see the fear flickering behind her carefully controlled expression. Captain Green stood before them, holding official documents from the War Department. His voice was steady but carried an undertone of genuine concern. "Ladies, transportation has been arranged for June 1st. You will be processed through displaced persons camps in Europe before being released to return to your homes or to locate any surviving family members." He paused, watching the mixture of relief and dread wash across their faces. "I want you to know that your conduct here has been exemplary. You have worked hard, learned much, and conducted yourselves with dignity. That will be reflected in your discharge papers." The words should have been comforting, but they landed like stones in still water. Return to what? Marguerite had received one letter from the Red Cross, informing her that her family home in Munich no longer existed, destroyed in Allied bombing raids. Her mother's fate was unknown. Her father had been killed on the Eastern Front 2 years earlier. Her brother was missing, presumed dead. Germany itself was a wasteland of rubble and starvation, occupied by foreign armies, its cities reduced to ash. Marguerite stood slowly, her legs trembling. Around her, other women shifted uncomfortably. Captain Green nodded for her to speak. She had practiced these words in English for days, but now her throat felt tight. "Captain Green," she began, her accent thick, but her words clear. "May I speak for some of us?" He gestured for her to continue. Marguerite looked around at the other women. 14 of them met her gaze with expressions of desperate hope. They had talked late into the night for weeks, debating, questioning, trying to find courage for what they were about to ask. "We know this is unusual," Marguerite said, each word carefully chosen. "We know we are prisoners. We know the war is over, and we should go home." She paused, gathering her courage. "But some of us, we do not wish to return to Germany immediately." The silence that followed was absolute. Captain Green's expression shifted from professional courtesy to genuine shock. Several American guards exchanged confused glances. Private Mueller, translating for those who needed it, stumbled over the words as if he couldn't believe what he was saying. Anna Weber stood next, followed by Elsa, then 12 others. They formed a small group within the larger assembly, their decision made. Hilda remained seated, tears streaming down her face, unable to choose between the country that had betrayed her and the prison camp that had shown her kindness. "Captain," Marguerite continued, her voice stronger now, "Germany is not our home anymore. The Germany we served, we discovered, was not the Germany we believed in. Here, in this camp, we have found something we never had before. We have been treated with dignity. We have found purpose. We have been shown that enemies can become something else. Captain Green sent an urgent telegram to Washington that same afternoon, describing the unprecedented situation unfolding at Camp Claiborne. 14 German women prisoners requesting to remain in American custody rather than accept repatriation. The legal implications were staggering. The Geneva Convention provided clear protocols for returning prisoners of war, but nothing about what to do when those prisoners refused to leave. While officials in Washington debated, life in the camp entered a strange limbo. The women who had requested to stay continued their daily routines with intensified purpose, as if their contributions might somehow influence distant bureaucrats making decisions about their futures. Marguerite threw herself into kitchen work with renewed dedication. She arrived before dawn to help Samuel prepare breakfast, stayed through lunch service, and often remained into the evening planning menus and managing supplies. Her English had become fluent through constant practice, and she found herself serving as translator and mediator not just for languages, but for cultural misunderstandings that arose daily. Samuel watched her transformation with quiet satisfaction. "You've got a gift," he told her one morning while they prepared fried okra for lunch. "Not just for cooking, but for helping folks understand each other. That's rarer than you might think." Marguerite carefully breaded each okra piece, her movements now as practiced as Samuel's own. "In Germany, I operated radios," she said softly. "I transmitted messages I didn't write, for purposes I didn't question. Here, for the first time, I feel like I'm actually communicating something that matters." She had begun corresponding with Samuel's daughter, Clara, who lived in Baton Rouge. Clara was a school teacher, and her letters were filled with questions about Germany, about the war, about what ordinary Germans had known or believed. The correspondence forced Marguerite to articulate thoughts she had been struggling to form, to confront her own complicity with honesty rather than excuses. The other women who had chosen to stay found their own ways to prove their worth. Elsa had discovered a talent for administrative work, reorganizing the camp's record-keeping system with German efficiency. Anna Weber worked in the medical facility, her gentle manner making her invaluable to Dr. Hayes. Each woman was carving out a space where she felt useful, necessary, wanted. But their integration wasn't without controversy. Word of their request had reached nearby towns, and reaction was mixed. Some local newspapers ran editorials questioning why Nazi prisoners should receive special treatment when American soldiers were still fighting in the Pacific. Other voices rose in the women's defense. Mrs. Henderson, a local schoolteacher who had visited the camp as part of a church group, wrote a passionate letter to the local paper. "These women are not the same people who arrived here months ago. They have shown genuine remorse, demonstrated real transformation, and proven that redemption is possible when people are given the chance to change." The debate intensified when Clara Washington added her voice, writing about her father's influence on the German prisoners. "My father has spent his life showing kindness to people who didn't deserve it. If he believes these women are worth saving, then I trust his judgment." 3 weeks after the initial request, the response from Washington finally arrived. The decision would change everything. June 20th, 1965. 20 years had passed since that unprecedented day when German women prisoners begged to remain in American captivity. Marguerite Fisher Green stood in her restaurant on Government Street in Baton Rouge, watching the lunch crowd fill the dining room. The establishment had become locally famous, not just for its food, but for the story behind it. On the wall hung a framed photograph from 1945 showing a group of German women in prison uniforms standing beside American soldiers, Samuel Washington prominent among them. The War Department's decision had been characteristically bureaucratic, but unexpectedly compassionate. The women would be reclassified as displaced persons rather than prisoners of war, making them eligible for immigration status if they could secure American sponsors. The response had been overwhelming. Local families, church groups, and businesses had stepped forward, moved by the women's obvious transformation and genuine remorse. Marguerite had been sponsored by the Henderson family initially, finding work as a translator for the State Department. But her heart had always remained in the kitchen, in those early morning hours, learning from Samuel how to turn simple ingredients into expressions of human dignity. She had married Thomas Green, Captain Green's nephew, in 1948. Their wedding had been attended by both former prisoners and former guards, a celebration that the local newspaper described as a symbol of reconciliation. Together they had opened this restaurant in 1952, serving traditional Southern food to an integrated clientele that would have been impossible just years earlier. Her signature dish, the one that appeared on every table, was fried okra. Golden, perfectly seasoned, crispy on the outside, and tender within. She had learned to make it from Samuel, and she made it the same way he had taught her, with the same attention and care. Samuel himself, now 84 years old, with hands gnarled by arthritis, still visited every Wednesday for lunch. He would sit at his usual table by the window, and Marguerite would bring him a plate of fried okra made exactly to his specifications. They would talk about the old days, about the camp, about the women who had scattered across America to build new lives. Elsa had married an accountant from New Orleans and had 3 children. Anna Weber had become Dr. Anna Weber, running a medical clinic in Lake Charles. Others had found their own paths, but they remained connected, writing letters and gathering annually to remember where they had come from and how far they had traveled. The story of the German women who chose to stay had become more than personal history. It had become a testament to America's capacity for redemption, proof that even in war's darkest hours, individual people could choose transformation over hatred. Marguerite often told customers about that first bite of fried okra, how a simple vegetable had taught an enemy prisoner that humanity could survive even when everything else seemed lost. Today, as she watched diners of every race and background sharing meals at her tables, she understood what Samuel had been trying to teach her all those years ago. That feeding people, really feeding them with care and dignity, was how you changed the world. One meal, one person, one choice at a time. The fried okra was more than food. It was a promise kept,